There was no first Homo sapiens. Not we haven't found them yet. Not the fossil record is incomplete. There was never a moment when a not quite human mother gave birth to a fully human child. No such individual existed, could have existed, or will ever be found. And understanding why is one of the more useful things anyone can learn about how evolution actually works. That does not make the question worthless. It makes it a much better question than it first appears, because everything interesting sits in why it cannot be answered the way it is asked. Let's dig into this properly, because the difficulty is built into the concept of species itself. A species, in the definition most people learn, is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That works reasonably well for a snapshot in time. Apply it across time and it collapses immediately, because every generation can interbreed with the one before it. Your parents were the same species as you. Their parents were the same species as them. Follow that chain back 100,000 generations and every single link holds. Each mother and child the same species as each other. And yet the creature at the far end of the chain is not remotely the same species as you. This is sometimes described as the species problem, and it is not a gap in knowledge. It is a consequence of applying discrete categories to a continuous process. Evolution produces gradual change across populations over enormous timescales, and species boundaries are lines that scientists draw afterwards, for convenience, on something that never had lines in it. The problem is easier to see with a physical example. Consider a color gradient running from red to orange. Every point on it is nearly identical to its neighbors. There is no pixel where red ends and orange begins, and if you asked 10 people to mark the boundary, you would get 10 different answers, all defensible. Now imagine that gradient is 400,000 years long, and the only evidence available is a few dozen fragments scattered unevenly along it, and you have roughly the situation in human origins. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it means that when a headline announces the oldest known Homo sapiens fossil, what has actually been announced is that a particular fossil has been assigned to that category by particular researchers using particular criteria. Other researchers frequently disagree. The fossil has not changed. The label has. Let's talk about what the fossils actually show too, because the picture has shifted substantially in recent decades. For a long time, the standard account placed the origin of anatomically modern humans in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, based largely on fossils from Ethiopia. Remains from Homo Sapiens and from Herto were dated to roughly that range, and were treated as the earliest members of our species. That account was disrupted in 2017 by material from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. Fossils recovered there, previously thought to be much younger, were redated to roughly 300,000 years ago, and the associated remains showed a striking combination. A face that looks essentially modern, paired with a brain case that is long and low rather than the tall, globular shape characteristic of people today. The dating of the Homo Sapiens material has also been revised, pushed back somewhat by analysis of a volcanic ash layer above it. The Jebel Irhoud finding did two things. It pushed the timeline back by roughly 100,000 years, and it complicated the geography, since Morocco is a very long way from East Africa. Combined with material from southern Africa and elsewhere, it supported a shift in thinking away from a single origin point toward what is sometimes called African multi-regionalism, or a Pan-African model, the idea that our lineage emerged from a network of populations spread across the continent, partially separated, occasionally exchanging genes, with modern features accumulating in different places at different times rather than appearing as a package in one location. Genetic evidence has broadly supported a complex picture, with the deepest divisions among living human populations being found within Africa, and with structure in ancient African populations that a simple, single-origin model does not capture well. The details remain actively debated among researchers using different methods and different assumptions, and it would misrepresent the field to present any specific version as settled. Let's talk about how any of this gets dated too, because this represents the machinery underneath every number quoted in the field, and knowing its limits explains why the dates keep moving. Radiocarbon dating, the method most people have heard of, is close to useless here. It works on organic material and becomes unreliable beyond roughly 50,000 years because the isotope it measures has decayed to levels too small to distinguish from contamination. Nearly everything discussed in human origins is far older than that, so other methods are required. Those methods generally date the sediment or the material around a fossil rather than the fossil itself. Argon-based techniques date volcanic layers, which is why sites with volcanic ash above and below a find are so valuable. The fossil is bracketed between two datable events. Luminescence methods estimate how long buried mineral grains have been shielded from sunlight. Electron spin resonance can be applied to tooth enamel. Uranium series methods work on mineral deposits, such as those forming on cave walls and floors. Each has assumptions that can fail. Sediment can be disturbed, with material moving downward through a deposit and appearing older or younger than it is. Volcanic layers can be reworked and redeposited. Uranium can move through material after burial. This is why redating is so common, and why a fossil's age can shift by 100,000 years without anyone having found anything new. The Jebel Irhoud material was known for decades before the revised dating transformed its significance. Naming carries similar difficulty. Species designations in paleoanthropology are proposed by researchers and accepted or rejected by the field over time, and the discipline has a long history of naming new species from small samples and later consolidating them. Some specialists favor splitting populations into many species, others favor lumping them into fewer, and the same fossils get sorted differently depending on which approach a given researcher takes. That disagreement is normal scientific practice rather than a scandal, and it does mean that counting how many human species existed produces different answers depending on whom you ask. Let's talk about the mosaic problem too, because this represents the reason no single fossil can be the first. The traits used to define anatomically modern humans do not arrive together. A high, rounded brain case, a small face tucked beneath the front of the skull, a projecting chin, reduced brow ridges, and a lightly built skeleton are the usual criteria, and the fossil record shows these appearing at different times in different populations. The Jebel Irhoud material has the modern face without the modern brain case. Other specimens show the reverse. Some have chins, and some do not. Researchers have described the emergence of modern skull shape as a process running over hundreds of thousands of years, with the fully globular brain case characteristic of recent humans appearing considerably later than the earliest fossils assigned to our species. Which combination of traits qualifies an individual as sapiens is a judgment call, and different specialists make it differently, which is precisely why the same fossil can be described as an early modern human in one paper and as something else in another. Let's talk about interbreeding too, because this represents the finding that did the most damage to the tidy version of the story. Analysis of ancient DNA established that populations outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry, and that populations in parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania carry additional ancestry from Denisovans, a group known primarily from genetic evidence and a small number of fragments. Further work has indicated additional episodes of gene flow, including into African populations, and evidence pointing toward interbreeding with populations that have not been identified from fossils at all. Sometimes described as ghost populations because they are visible only in the genomes of their descendants. That means the boundary of our species is porous in exactly the way the interbreeding definition says it should not be. Groups that most researchers classify as separate species produced offspring who had children of their own, and the genetic consequences are present in living people. It also means the ancestry of anyone alive today is not a single line running back through one population, but a braided network, with strands joining and separating repeatedly. An individual has been recovered that illustrates this with unusual force. A bone fragment from Denisova Cave in Siberia, from a girl who died around 13 years old, whose genome showed a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A first-generation hybrid of two different human groups, found in a cave, by chance, from a tiny fragment. The odds of recovering such an individual are extremely low, which suggests that this kind of mixing was not rare. Let's talk about the company we kept too, because this represents a fact that reshapes the whole question and is truly difficult to absorb. Being the only human species on the planet is an anomaly. For most of the past several million years, multiple hominin species existed at the same time, sometimes in the same regions, and the situation we live in now, one species everywhere, alone, has held for only a small fraction of that history. The list of contemporaries is longer than most people expect. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for a few 100,000 years. and disappeared somewhere around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans ranged across Asia, known mainly from genetics, and a handful of fragments including a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Homo erectus persisted in Southeast Asia for an extraordinarily long time, with some Indonesian material suggesting survival until relatively late. Homo floresiensis, small-bodied and small-brained, lived on the island of Flores. Homo luzonensis has been described from the Philippines from fragmentary remains. Homo naledi, found in a South African cave system, combines primitive and derived traits and has been dated far more recently than its anatomy initially suggested. The dating of several of these overlaps with the existence of our own species, which means that for a substantial stretch of time there were several distinct kinds of human on Earth simultaneously. Some of them met. We know this because their DNA is in living people. Why only one remains is an open and uncomfortable question. Proposed factors include competition for resources, differences in social network size and information sharing, demographic advantages, disease exchange, climatic instability, and absorption through interbreeding rather than replacement. The evidence supports contributions from several of these and settles none of them, and researchers who study the disappearance of Neanderthals in particular disagree substantially about the relative weight of each. Let's talk about how few of us there were too, because this represents a dimension of the story that changes how the whole thing feels. Human populations through most of this period were small. Estimates derived from genetic diversity in living people suggest effective population sizes in the low tens of thousands for long stretches, which is far smaller than the actual head count, but still indicates a species that was not numerous by any standard. There have been proposals of severe bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped sharply. One widely discussed hypothesis linked a bottleneck to a massive volcanic eruption at Toba in Indonesia roughly 74,000 years ago, arguing that the resulting climatic disruption nearly eliminated our ancestors. That specific claim has been substantially challenged, with archaeological evidence from sites in Africa and India showing continuity of occupation across the ash layer, and it is now regarded skeptically by many researchers. A separate genetic analysis has proposed a much older and more severe bottleneck several 100,000 years ago, and that finding has also drawn methodological criticism. Both should be treated as contested rather than established. The dispersals out of Africa were similarly not a single event. Fossil and archaeological evidence points to multiple movements of humans into Eurasia across a long period, including early excursions into the Levant well over 100,000 years ago that appear to have left no lasting genetic trace in living populations. The dispersal that gave rise to essentially all present-day non-African ancestry appears to have occurred later, and the reduced genetic diversity found outside Africa relative to within it is a direct consequence of that founding group being small. That last point deserves emphasis, since it is frequently misunderstood. Human genetic diversity is greatest within Africa, and populations elsewhere represent a subset of it. Every non-African alive today descends from a comparatively small group of people who left, which is why two individuals from different African populations can be more genetically distinct from each other than either is from someone on the other side of the world. Let's talk about behavior too, because this represents an entirely separate question from anatomy and the two do not line up neatly. Even granting a date for anatomically modern humans, there is a further argument about when people started behaving in ways we would recognize, producing art, ornament, complex tools, symbolic burial, long-distance exchange, and evidence of abstract thought. An older view held that these appeared relatively suddenly. In Europe, roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, sometimes called the behavioral revolution, or the Great Leap Forward. That view has been substantially undermined. Engraved ochre and shell beads from southern African sites push symbolic behavior back considerably further. Pigment processing workshops, complex heat-treated stone tools, and evidence of marine resource exploitation appear at various African sites well before the supposed revolution. The current tendency is toward a gradual accumulation of modern behaviors across Africa over a long period, with the apparent European burst reflecting where archaeologists concentrated their efforts for over a century rather than where things actually happened first. There is also evidence complicating any assumption that our species had a monopoly on such behavior. Neanderthal sites have yielded pigment use, shaped objects, structures built deep inside caves from broken stalagmites, and evidence of deliberate burial, and cave markings in Spain have been dated by some researchers to a period before modern humans are thought to have arrived there. Each of these claims has been contested on grounds of dating or interpretation, and the overall direction of the evidence has nonetheless been to narrow the perceived gap. Let's talk about what we cannot see too, because this represents a limitation that shapes the entire discipline. Fossils preserve bone. They do not preserve skin, hair, muscle, fat, internal organs, or brain tissue, and they preserve behavior only through the objects people left behind. That means nearly everything that would let you recognize someone as a person is invisible. The consequences are substantial. We do not know what any extinct human species sounded like. Vocal anatomy involves soft tissue, and while researchers have made inferences from the shape of the base of the skull, from the hyoid bone, and from the size of the canal carrying nerves to the tongue, all of these are indirect and each has been disputed. Whether Neanderthals had language in the full modern sense is argued over vigorously, with the genetic evidence, including shared variants of genes implicated in speech, suggesting capability without settling the question. Skin and hair are similarly obscure. Ancient DNA has allowed some inferences about pigmentation genes in specific individuals, and those findings have repeatedly overturned earlier assumptions. Reconstructions of extinct hominins in museums and documentaries are informed guesses about everything except the underlying bone structure and the choices made, how much hair, what expression, what posture, what skin tone, carry assumptions that have shifted noticeably over the decades in ways that track changing attitudes as much as changing evidence. Even brain size, which does leave a trace in skull volume, is a poor guide to capability on its own. Neanderthal brain cases were on average as large as ours or larger, arranged in a different shape, and inferring anything about thinking from that difference has proven extremely difficult. The honest position is that we can describe the container in detail and say relatively little about what was happening inside it. Let's talk about what the question is really reaching for too, because there is a legitimate one underneath it. People asking who the first Homo sapiens was usually want to know something like, when did the ancestors of everyone alive today become recognizably us? That can be approached with caveats. If the criterion is anatomy, the answer is somewhere around 300,000 years ago at the earliest, based on current fossils, with the fully modern skull shape appearing later, and the process spread across Africa rather than concentrated in one place. If the criterion is genetics, there is a different kind of answer available. Every living person shares a most recent common ancestor in the maternal line, traced through mitochondrial DNA, and a corresponding one in the paternal line traced through the Y chromosome. These are frequently given misleading nicknames suggesting a first woman and first man, and it is worth being clear about what they actually mean. These were ordinary individuals living in large populations among many contemporaries, most of whom also have living descendants, just not through an unbroken maternal or paternal line specifically. The two did not live at the same time and never met. The dates for both are estimates with substantial uncertainty and are revised as methods improve. If the criterion is behavior, the answer is a long gradient with no clear threshold, running across at least 100,000 years and probably considerably more. Let's talk about why the tidy version is so persistent, too, because this represents a problem in how the subject gets communicated rather than a problem in the science. Human minds handle categories far more comfortably than gradients, and narrative demands beginnings. A story about the first human is satisfying in a way that a story about a slowly shifting distribution of traits across a network of African populations is not. Museum displays, textbook diagrams, and the familiar March of Progress image showing a sequence of figures straightening up all reinforce the idea of a linear sequence with identifiable stages. That image is thoroughly misleading. Human evolution is better pictured as a braided stream or a tangled bush with multiple hominin species coexisting for long stretches, some interbreeding, most going extinct. For most of the past few million years, several kinds of human-like creature were alive simultaneously. The current situation, where only one remains, is unusual and recent, and it is arguably the strangest fact in the whole field. Let's talk about ancient DNA too, because this represents the single biggest methodological change in the field, and it arrived remarkably recently. For the entire history of paleoanthropology up to the late 20th century, the evidence was bones and stones. Researchers measured skulls, compared shapes, and argued about which similarities indicated relationship and which were coincidence. Those arguments could run for decades without resolution, because the evidence could not settle them. Extracting genetic material from ancient remains changed the terms completely. DNA degrades over time, breaking into ever shorter fragments and accumulating chemical damage, and it survives best in cold, stable, dry conditions, which is why so much of the early work came from northern latitudes and why tropical sites remain difficult. The technical obstacles were formidable. Distinguishing genuine ancient sequences from contamination by modern human DNA from the handlers and the laboratory required methods that took years to develop, and several early published results turned out to be contamination. Once those problems were addressed, results arrived quickly and repeatedly overturned established views. Neanderthal genomes were sequenced. An entirely new population, the Denisovans, was identified from a finger bone fragment on genetic evidence alone, before anyone knew what they looked like. Interbreeding was demonstrated. Techniques were developed to recover DNA from cave sediments without any fossil present at all, meaning researchers can now detect which species occupied a site from the dirt. The limits are real and worth stating. Ancient DNA has a hard ceiling in time, with the oldest hominin genetic material recovered so far reaching a few 100,000 years under exceptional preservation conditions. Most of the human story lies beyond it, and genetics answers questions about relatedness and population history without directly addressing anatomy, behavior, or what any of these people were like. Well, it has been transformative, and it has not replaced the fossils. It has given them a second independent line of evidence to be checked against. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. There was no first Homo sapiens because species boundaries are categories imposed on a continuous process after the fact. Every individual in the chain of our ancestry belonged to the same species as their parents and their children, and the change accumulated across an enormous number of such steps, none of which was a boundary. The oldest fossils currently assigned to our species date to roughly 300,000 years ago from Morocco, and they show a modern face on an archaic brain case, which illustrates the point that modern traits assembled piecemeal rather than arriving together. Evidence increasingly supports emergence from a network of populations across Africa, rather than a single origin point. Interbreeding with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and probably other groups makes the species boundary porous in living people's genomes. And behavioral modernity accumulated gradually over a long period, rather than switching on. The most defensible answer is that becoming human was not an event. It was a process spread across hundreds of thousands of years and an entire continent involving many populations, no single one of which can be identified as the point of origin. Let's talk about the naming itself too, because this represents a piece of history that quietly shapes how the question gets asked. Homo sapiens was named by Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century, and unlike every other species he described, he provided no diagnostic physical description for it. Where other entries listed distinguishing features, his entry for humans effectively instructed the reader to know themselves. That is charming, and it left the category without a definition, which is a problem the field has been working around ever since. The subsequent history of classifying human remains was entangled with the assumptions of the eras doing the classifying, and some of that history is truly ugly. 19th and early 20th century researchers frequently sorted living human populations into ranked types, measured skulls in service of those rankings, and interpreted fossil evidence through frameworks that assumed a hierarchy. Those frameworks were wrong on the evidence and were used to justify serious harm. Modern genetics has comprehensively established that human variation is continuous, that most genetic variation occurs within populations rather than between them, and that the traditional racial categories do not correspond to distinct biological groupings. The reason this matters for the question at hand is that any account of who counts as the first fully modern human inherits the assumption that there is a threshold to cross. and thresholds invite ranking. The scientific answer removes the threshold entirely. There is no line, no first individual, and no population that became human before any other. Only an enormously long gradient across an entire continent from which every person alive descends. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If you could travel back through your own ancestors, meeting each one in turn, you would never find the moment the line stopped being human. You would simply notice eventually that it had, somewhere among tens of thousands of individuals who all looked entirely ordinary to their own mothers.